My name is Dr. Joe Stallman, and I got to do housekeeping, but I personally want to thank all of you for coming here today to listen to me talk about the stuff that I love to do. It's really, Jody said this is an encore presentation, and it very much is in the spirit of that. But I think, a few weeks ago there was a presentation and it didn't go well. And, in hindsight afterward, I think it affected me so much because it made me realize how much I care about what I do. And I felt a bit insulted for myself, but for everyone else there with us, because whoever's at a talk that I give, you obviously care about the same kind of things that I care about, and I felt like all of us were a little bit affronted by that. And I'm sorry that happened. But what I'm really happy about is that I have a chance to come and do it again. And so, this moment has made me realize, and you might have heard me talk about this a little bit before, when I came and talked last May with Summit County. And I think, what I have to share with today, I think it offers something to a piece of legislation that we're still kind of trying to learn and grapple with, even though it's 35 years old. It is a living document, just like those treaties are, and we have to learn to work and live with this piece of legislation and understand what it means. But before I get too far into that story, I really would like to thank Dr. Kathy Fay, Dr. Jody Kearns, Francisco Ugaldi, Summit Metro Parks, Mr. Mike Johnson, Charlotte Ginn. I haven't had to say her name before. Ginturk. She's with Summit Parks, and Megan Schaefer, who's the director for archaeology at Summit Metro Parks. I thank all of them for having me come to your wonderful city. I know I don't know everyone here, and I'm starting to learn people, and if I get your name wrong or I forget who you might be, forgive me, and I will learn who you are. And hopefully we will become great friends. So a few weeks ago this thing happened, but it made me go back to my origin story of why I do this. And I think it's really important because it's really been it's allowed me to have a critical lens on my education. Because I have the same education you guys do. University, Western based. I went to Idaho State University. I went to Indiana University. However, when I left school, I felt like my take on education was a little bit different, and it might be who I am and how I grew up. And so for me, I'm Tuscarora, but I'm also Pennsylvania Dutch. And so I live in a country where we're kind of forced to pick a race sometimes by the way that we're born. And so when I was born in 1972, my family was kind of burdened with, well, what is Joe? Is he white or is he Indian? And so my whole life I've been bouncing back and forth through that. And it's kind of led me on some curious little travels. Travels that I really love because, for one, here today I'm talking to all of you about my journey. Like you're another part in the step in it. And so for me, growing up being Germanic American and Tuscarora, it made me a little confused. It made me wonder, what is race? What am I? I lived with my mom most of the time, and she was non-native, so does that make me non-native? But if I live in the United States, someone has to check a box, and sometimes you default to the minority parent. And it's a weird thing. And for me, growing up in this time, it was a very strange journey for me because I never got to pick who I wanted to be at any point in that journey. It was always picked for me by some category, some checkbox, some census data, and that kind of really bothered me, and it kind of led me on a journey. And so at a very early age, I started to read, and I started to read a lot. And so not just reading alone, but I'm a child of my time, so I took in TV, I took in movies, I took in family stories. And all of this stuff kind of just fed into this idea, what is race, what is it to be native, what is it to be European, what is it to be a settler, what does it mean to be Aboriginal? And I found it really fascinating, and so by the time that I made it to college, and I started college kind of late, by the time I got there, I enrolled as an anthropology major, and I never changed. And I stayed there that whole time, and it's really been the most interesting learning that I've ever had in my life, because it's not just the textbooks, it's not just doing the research, it's not just doing interviews, it's actually critiquing the education system and how it's applied to peoples of color, new Americans, people who might belong to a different religion or a different worldview, frankly. And I found that really fascinating, because as I went through school, as I struggled with that, with who I was or who I thought I wanted to be, or I just didn't know, I started to see how it affected other people in my life. People of color, new Americans, international students, women, just about everyone. And I found that we're all affected by this thing, and it affected me in a lot of, I think, deeply meaningful ways that really colored the way that I look at things like race, which I don't believe in anymore. But I still have to struggle with it as an American, right? Because that's a label that's been imposed on me, being an American. And that's a difficult one, and why it's being imposed on me, I guess I'm going to participate in some arenas of it. And for me, I would like to dismantle a few of those things, because I find them kind of, they prevent us from getting to the places that I think the forefathers of this country really wanted us to go as a people. And things like race really stops us, I think. However, I still have to deal with it. You know, it's just one of those things. However, when I got into anthropology, you can check a box and say you're an anthropology major, but there are 4 subfields, and then there's numerous subfields. And they kind of want you to pick from the beginning and kind of go through that track course. You guys know all of this. And so for me, I was all over the board. I did archaeology, I did history, I did linguistics, I did social cultural, I did a lot of ethnographic work. I did a lot of qualitative and quantitative research. I was interested in all of it. I really got into folklore. I have a minor in folklore. I'm fascinated by stories, because it really dawned on me, it doesn't matter who you are. You can be the president of the United States or a university teacher. We're telling stories. And some of us just do it better than others, And so for me, I was trying to figure out, so what does that mean about myself and my ethnicities? And it just kind of led me on this really interesting journey that I still love every day. However, at one point I got into this, and I started really being critical about the literature that I was reading in anthropology. So this is a map from an archaeological book that came out about 1990, and this book is still looked at as a quintessential book on Iroquois archaeology. And so for 35 years, people have been looking at this map. I find it a little problematic. However, the main point of this slide is, when I was in those settings, trying to understand what anthropology was and how it's a science, I was being told what a Native American was, or an American Indian, or a Haudenosaunee person, and that's the term that we actually prefer, is Haudenosaunee and not Iroquois. And so, as I'm learning on what an Iroquois is, not at one moment did I realize that any of the professors were actually talking about my family, or the Haudenosaunee has a lived people, and they fit into all of these categories. And I realized that all of these categories like matrilineal and matriarchal, they all have meaning and purpose in our field, but they don't have any meaning to my family. They're meaningless because my family operates as anyone else's family. We're family. And we know how that works. Maybe subconsciously sometimes, or we know who drives the family sometimes. And so I found that really interesting because within my own culture, my father's culture, I started to notice things that weren't really talked about in anthropology, and I'll quickly go through them. You know, there's a balance within our society, and there's a balance that's really important because it's a balance that keeps the community healthy. And so in every culture, so this is something that I learned from the field, every culture has a healthy balance. There's all of these mechanisms that are in play that allows us to have healthy and full lives for every person. And so I'm reading all of this anthropology, and none of it is making any real sense to me of how any of that information being fed to me through lectures or stories actually reflect anything that I know about the people that I love at home. And so that made me really curious about the field, because what we have here is a worldview of people who have a dualistic balance of how to achieve a sense of equilibrium through your genders, through your political views, through your clans, and everything is held into place by practice. And I wasn't reading any of that in the field. I was reading the Iroquois are this and the Iroquois are that, and it just didn't make sense to me. And I saw through a window at that moment of how I think my perspective, or what I was seeing as a young person at the time, like what didn't make sense to me. And so what I simply started to do was to talk about what didn't make sense to me. And it's really opened a lot of doors for me. Because I also found out those things that didn't make sense to me also didn't make sense to folks like y'all. You know, you saw like something wasn't a one-to-one sometimes. And so I started thinking about the practices that my family still held and the practices that started to slip away. And I saw all of this remnants, everything that we did with the world. And, you know, once again, history and anthropology can really color the way that we see a people. It can really affect the ways that we see people. And so if someone tells you that those people are cannibals, guess what happens? You tend to think they're cannibals. And so for over 100 years in American history and anthropology, people didn't talk about us as human beings, they talked about us as subjects. And so for that entirety of time, we were never talked about in ways that I found meaningful, like gender equality. So my community lived with gender equality where men and women are equally footed. And I live in the United States, and when did that happen? 100 years ago?
1920?
Yeah. And so that would say that we were a little bit more advanced if I was going to put a label on it, right? But I don't. But you see how people live differently, and none of that was really talked about in the things that I was learning about, because in my own community, people are still have those titles of respect and adherence that anthropologists don't talk about. We have clan mothers. And so my father belongs to the Beaver clan, and 3 years ago we got a new clan mother because the last one passed on, and so my cousin Ange is now their clan mother. And so she makes sure that we have this gendered balance within the community by the types of conversations that she's continuing on. And for me, you know, I'm not here to bash social science at all, but for me, it's just things that I didn't see that made sense to me as a human being, right? And I also see ways that maybe we can figure out how to begin talking about these things again. And so another way that we can balance the world is that we had a philosophical concept that's in this belt right here. This belt is called one dish, one spoon. And Jody, Brian. So this was in Ontario in 1701. The French, the British, the Mississauga, some Anishinaabe people, and the Haudenosaunee were fighting over Ontario. And so we went into a treaty with everyone And we call this one dish, one spoon, where we share the earth. And so the white around it means peace, and the center is actually a dish with a spoon in it right here. It's a symbolic spoon. And so that was one of the first types of UNs that I'm aware of in North America. And so those are the types of things that I find really interesting and I want to talk about. However, as I worked my way through school, I'm a student and I had to get a job. And I found a job in a museum because I was a Native person and there was this law called NAGPRA implemented, and so they were like, hey, we'll have Joe do that. And wow, that was really an amazing experience. So, there's a very well-known anthropologist. He's probably one of the more famous or infamous anthropologists of the mid-20th century. His name is William Fenton. And he wrote extensively about wampum, but not at one time did he really talk about the importance of this one. And it was always just kind of put into an artistic label, wampum, or sometimes it was put into a more of an intellectual category like beadwork. And sometimes it's put into an artistic category. And so within all of those moments, not once did I hear how there's a worldview here. This is Wikipedia. This is an origin story. It's a map. It's actually a map of New York. A lot of people don't realize that. And then it also talks about people's sovereignty. And so each white square is actually, it means, this is a band of peace around each community. And so this is the Seneca community right here. And so that community has their own sense of peace around it, their own balance. But also what it means is, inside that box is their business, so you leave them alone. You have no right to mess with them. That's their own community and they have their own standards. But when I work in places like Ohio, with the earthwork sites right now, we're talking about roads that stretch between the earthworks, and we think there's roads of peace. And so in my knowledge of Haudenosaunee people, the roads are actually the commons. They're paths of peace, and so on this map, we have a path of peace. This is a white road of peace that goes from community to community. And so just something like this has a lot of information in it. And I don't mean to go too far into it, but my point is there's more to these things than just being objects. They're really meaningful. And they're living documents. But I wanted to show everyone of how it's a map real quick. Remember that not very good map that we looked at a few minutes ago? Oh, so I went through a phase where I did not like maps. I thought all maps were lies. And so this map comes from a book in 1990. And do you see how big the Seneca Nation is? It made me really question, at what time period is this? And what Seneca Nation? Because when I was working for Seneca Nation, this was my territory map. These are all the counties that I covered 90% of the time for Seneca Nation. And so they don't match up to even what anthropologists talk about. And if you wanted to know the complete truth, this map has been reduced because it starts in 1768 with the Treaty of Proclamation. And that was a boundary line between the Great Britain and the Haudenosaunee. And so this is actually a reduced map starting in 1768, and it doesn't match any of the maps. It never does. And so this has kind of been one of my little irks that I've been working on. I'm getting better at it. But I found myself in college because I really did love maps, and I tried to teach myself what's the easiest way to show people that we do think differently. And everything that you might read from an anthropologist might not meld with how we think and see the world. And if I had one image to show you, it would be this one. So just very quickly, this might be the third time you've heard me say this, but where is this? If you heard it before, don't say anything.
That's Buffalo. That's Buffalo, right?
Niagara Falls in the middle, Buffalo. Niagara River.
Right here?
Mm-hmm.
So this is Ontario, this is New York, and this is that little triangle of Pennsylvania. And so for us, northing is not the most important direction, it's the rising of the sun, which is the east. And so if we had a point of orientation, it's going to be towards the east of the rising sun. And so that's our northing. And then every other place, so you said Buffalo? So Buffalo is a meaningless word to us. And so every place on here, these are just Seneca names that we had. And so every place is meaningful. And so we don't have names that don't have a reference to something. And so all of these names are a reference to a relationship with the world in that area. And so Buffalo is actually called the place of the basswoods. And that's where the Buffalo River goes out into Lake Erie. And it's a very important diplomatic area that people from different nations would come to the basswoods and they would meet once a year. And so that's what that is right here, place of the basswoods. And so every place has a meaningful name. Some places are the place of the bitter waters, place of the plentiful deer, of the Baldy Peak, and it goes on, but it's all meaningful and it's built into the relationship that people have with the world, their mental worldviews, and just everything like that. And so for me, if I had one opportunity to show you how we think differently, I think this map is it. And so the second question that I got a lot in museums, in professional settings, but also amongst family and friends is, how did Americans take over? How did they land on the eastern shores, and before you know it, this place is called the United States of America? And it was actually very easy, and I'm not going to go into it all, but I want people to really understand that there was a shifting between people and cultures that lasted for about 300 years, and by the time that we got to the Civil War, indigenous peoples in places like Ohio were displaced. They were forcibly removed. And a number of things that happened in that process, everything from diseases to a loss of culture. So when people think of the fur trade, I think of a loss of the arts. Because people quit doing things with hides, they started buying cotton. People stopped doing things with hides and they started buying things with wool. When Europeans came, they brought metal kettles. And so women, so this gender equality that we have in our communities is based around the idea of pottery. And so in our community, when Europeans came, men started to meet men in the woods because that's a gendered space. And men started to make deals with men, and men started bringing home metal kettles. And so on a very basic level, that imbalance created a gender imbalance, and guess what, on top of it, women stopped making pots. So we have a good friend in common, Pete Jones, and Pete Jones is kind of atypical because he's a male person, but he revived pottery. And so he's kind of like this anomaly. And if we lived at a different time, we would probably define Pete in another gender-like term in order for it to be okay for him to make pottery. It's an interesting world that I live in right now. Diplomacy practices also changed, right? So this belt right here is the first treaty between the Haudenosaunee and a European power, and it goes to 1603. This is the Treaty of the Truro. The white is the Peace River of Life, and this purple strand is the Dutch, who are in their ship traveling this river of life. And in this strand we have the Haudenosaunee, who are in their canoe and they're staying in their lanes, so to speak. and they're traveling the river of life together. And this is the first treaty between a European power and the Haudenosaunee. Pretty cool, huh? And so with Europeans, that changed, because as soon as Washington became the president, the United States wanted to go about doing treaties a little bit differently. They stopped wanting to do wampum and rely solely on paper. And so that whole process changed. And then we have language change. So one of the things about Eastern United States is that we have a lot of pidgins, which are kind of dying out. But we also had a universal language, which was sign language. So when you're doing trade or commerce on that white road of peace, you needed to talk to other people, and sometimes people didn't understand the languages that you spoke. And so you had one common language, which was sign language. And so by the 1920s, that language has American Indians knew it was a dead language. And then the warfare. And so when we look at history books, I'm trying to be quick here. When we look at history books, you know, everything is categorized. We have the War of 1812. We have the American Revolution. We have the Civil War. And so everything is in a compartment. However, through lived history, indigenous peoples had to live through everything, and we never had a break. We didn't have a break between the war, the American Revolution and the 1812 war. It was a continuation. We were dealing with the fallout from the war. We were making treaties. We lost people to disease and warfare, and so we never had like this recovery. However, warfare is one of those things that really impacts a community to the point that, so in 2025, there are only about 127, 130 indigenous communities east of the Mississippi. And prior to 1830, there were hundreds. And so it's really impacted us in ways. And so for me, as a young person, I'm really fascinated by all the stuff that I'm learning, but when I go and talk to my family, I realize that my family doesn't have time to care about this kind of stuff like I do. Because they're worried about feeding their kids. They're worried about keeping the lights on. And so you don't have time to keep thinking about your history or your culture sometimes and the lofty ways that we get to do it in academia. And so it made a lot of sense to me that museums were kind of the right place where I was, because I can see breakages. I understand that. And I want to look for ways that allows us to maybe make minor repairs to re-knit this a little bit. But I think one of the things that was the worst on us outside of the wars was the boarding schools, because that's where they started to change our minds the most. And so in the 20th century, almost every indigenous leader in the Indian Reorganization Act of 1930, every leader was elected in a non-traditional way, and a lot of them were educated at boarding schools. And so it changed the way that indigenous communities were governed. Not all of them, but a lot of them. A few weeks ago, we were in Jim Thorpe, Pennsylvania. If you have never been there, there's a town in Pennsylvania, and they renamed their town after Jim Thorpe. Jim Thorpe died in 1953 from liver disease, I believe, and he was destitute. And so his wife at the time made an agreement with the town of Malchunk, Pennsylvania, to ship his body to the town, and they would have a memorial for him, and they renamed the town in his honor, Jim Thorpe. And so being in that town was a little funny in a lot of ways, but the one thing that I want to bring up is that misunderstanding of history really became clear for me when I was reading the story of Jim Thorpe, because the non-indigenous writers writing his biography treated Carlisle Indian School like it was a college choice, when it was forced education, when little kids were taken from their families, put on trains, and sent to schools hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles away. But visiting and reading that town, as well-intended and well-meaningful those folks were, they didn't understand things as simple as a boarding school. Whereas when I go home and visit my family, I can still see effects of those times because they get carried on through behaviors. And so for me, I really like the arts, I really like the ethnographic object, I really like history, I really just like it all, really. And throughout my life, I have taken on different jobs. Within the last decade, I was a director of an American Indian museum, and I got to work with living artists. And that was probably the next level up in my education, was working directly with like 20 potters at once. Because when you're in academia, sometimes you have your blinders on and you can't see these larger pictures, but working with artists and their settings in cultural, meaningful ways really kind of started to change all of those critiques that I had about the field. It allowed me to apply them more and think of creative ways of working with those partnerships, but also understanding and drawing out things like worldview. And so for me, I can find worldview in anything that I look at. And so this pencil sketch, it looks like it's made with markers or watercolors. You know, it's from 1803. And this is a man, Dennis Cusick. He painted out his creation story while he was in a boarding school in Buffalo, New York. And so he did the whole creation story, and I really love it. This one is a contemporary artist. She's Seneca, and she lives in Portland. And this piece is, I don't think she minds me telling you, but one day she was looking outside of her apartment, and she was watching the sunrise, and she started thinking about her deceased father. And he was an iron worker, and so he made skyscrapers for about 30 years. And so she quilted this, it's a quilt, and it fits a full-size bed. And she quilted this sunrise thinking about her father. I think it's really amazing. This one is when the Haudenosaunee started to embrace beadwork before it all changed for the tourist trade. And so within this beaded piece, there's a story of a creation story of where the turtle comes out of the water and the people are born from love on the back of a turtle. And it's a long, long story. We don't have time for it. I won't do it, no matter how much you ask. This is like 20 minutes. But there's a creation story right here in this beaded piece. And it's a little pocket purse. And there's the whole creation story within that. And so that's the stuff that I like to do and find. To me, that's where, you know, I get to think about this stuff, because when I went to college, and all of us who have gone to college, you know, they want you to have a well-rounded education. They want you to know who Aristotle is and Dante and all of these other folks, and they want you to have grounding in all of these 5 subfields, right, of ways of knowing: metaphysics, epistemology, ethics, aesthetics, politics. And for me, being Haudenosaunee, I wasn't learning any of that in any of my anthro classes about my family. And it quickly dawned on me, these are things that you cannot find in a book. You have to spend them amongst the people and around your family. But it's a learning thing, right? But how do we do this with our own young people? We don't have these institutions, but we do have other spaces, and we have shared spaces, and I look for those opportunities of finding ways of sharing those things with not just my own, but with everyone, because I think everyone should know about this stuff. There is so much amazing things about indigenous peoples that we just lack from the lack of education. And so for us, you know, we learn them through stories. Do you see this doll in the background? Mm-hmm. That's a child's toy, but it's one of the most important lessons that we get growing up. And that is to keep yourself from being vain. Keep yourself grounded and humble. Because there's a story of a little girl who she was told when she was a little girl that she was beautiful. And so she believed it. And everywhere she went, she started to compare herself with other people in her life. And the creators gave her a warning and said, the next time you do it, we're going to make you where you can't see your face. And the little girl listened a few times, then one day she forgot about it and she went up to her friend and did a selfie, and her face went blank. And so for the rest of her life, whenever she saw a reflection of herself, she couldn't see her face. And so we see that worldview in all of our stories, and through the objects. And even through, toys. And there's a lot in it. And so through all of these things, we learn about peace, we learn about sharing the world, we learn about coming to one mind, and that's an important thing. And the founding fathers, they structured a lot of this new government around the idea of the Haudenosaunee forms of governance. But one of the things that they didn't do, well, outside of gender, and the list goes on. But one of the things that they didn't do was go do a consensus model of governance. And so you live in a country where it's 51% is majority, and that's why we have a lot of indecision in this country. This is why we have a lot of divisiveness. This is why we have a lot of politics, people on the left and right, because we don't come to one mind. And so my community very long ago realized that that was an impediment to a balanced peace. And so everything that we try to do is based on a consensus. And then we understand that we live in a relationship with the entire world, and so at the beginning of every public performance, we do a Ganonyok. And within that Ganonyok, we think everything alive, from the waters to the stars, to remind us that we are pretty humble. We're just people representing maybe a department, maybe an institution, or a clan, or a family's perspective. And so for us, I try to bring that to my work. And so I'm going to try to move through this real quick because I just seem to be talking today, and I'm sorry. But how do we know and what do we think about when we peer in the collections? And so for me, I had to struggle with that a lot working through ethnographic and art collections, especially in non-native institutions, because people label us in a lot of different ways, like rattles, right? We think rattles are a really harmless term, but it's really a complicated situation because a rattle isn't just a musical instrument like it's usually labeled in the collection reports. It's usually a sacred object, and it's also referencing a very sacred animal within our worldviews. And so we don't see any of that. And so a lot of times, objects like rattles won't make it onto a NAGPRA list because the anthropologist or the ethnographer or the purchaser or the curator labeled it as something else. I'll talk about these ones later. And so for me, I started thinking about sacredness because that's one of the categories in NAGPRA. And to me, when you work in a museum and a non-native museum and they focus on archaeology, they tend to have thousands of drawers of arrowheads. And so you just open them up and they could be very long, like 24 pounds, and there's nothing but stone tools. And anthropologists have, they've done a lot of great work with stone tools. They do diagnostics, they tell us about the shapes and what they're made out of, but they kind of treat them like they're just whatever. And for me, one day I was looking at the collections and I was looking at projectile points, and it really dawned on me that projectile points are actually the most sacred objects in the museum, and they're being treated like they're just nothing. And the reason why that is that in order for a hunter to be successful in the hunt, or if there was an interpersonal engagement, you would pray and ask for blessings. You would wish strong medicine for yourself and your side in the hunt or the event. And so you would bestow a lot of personal medicine on each projectile point in order a successful hunt or war moment. And so it really, and then there's other situations where archaeologists, they dig in mounds and they find caches. And so this is from Cahokia. And there's about, I think there's 300 of these. They're all made in the same shape, similar stones, and they were placed with a burial. And so instantly I'm like, how is this not sacred? And if I were to go to the repository right now, I can almost guarantee that not all of these projectile points are clustered together, and nor are they associated with a burial. This one is closer to home. I believe this one is in Chillicothe. It's 700 stone blades. And so these blades are about this big. And they were also found in a burial, in a mound. And right now, these are not clustered together. They were never treated as being special because they were just stone tools. And so these are one of the shortcomings that I had with the field, because you know how I see the world and how I think my family might be seeing the world doesn't match up with the knowledge of anthropology and how we're educating people with that limited inference into someone, into a people. But the one thing that really kind of bothered me is that, you know, anthropology and history and archaeology, all of these fields are treated with the utmost respect and reverence, that anthropological knowledge has seeped into the public sphere. And so no matter where you go, the History Channel, you can look at your evening news and someone's talking about an archaeology project. And so all of that terminology and reference has made it into the public. And so even with the lay person, they continuously change the way that they see projectile points as well. And I find that a little problematic, because for me, each one of these objects are a sacred object, and they have been repositioned in ways that I don't necessarily find approving. I believe that was on Etsy. Jody, I have to hurry. So then I want to talk about ceramics. And so for me, ceramics are really important. And they're one of those things in the collections that sometimes we put a lot of reverence to them, and sometimes we don't, because we just think they're for food and water and space storage. And so for us in the Haudenosaunee, ceramics were really important because that's the foundation of the gender balance between male and females. And so since the beginning of our culture, as I understand it, women were always the ceramicists, but that led them to a lot of decision making within the community. And so as you know from anthropology courses, native communities moved like every 10, 15, 20 years. But what you don't learn in the field is that women chose the next site because they knew where the clay sources were. They needed to have ready access to clay so they can make the pots. And then within those pots, they created knowledge, and they passed it on through their children and others around them. And so sometimes we don't understand that complexity when things are kind of reduced to, you know, pot types, what the pots might be made out of, the types of chemicals, and then using stratigraphy and placement within archaeological sites. Archaeologists will place types through time. But not at once do I ever talk about how pots are really important. Pots were also water drums. And so those little handheld pots that you might be finding in collections might not ever have hold a cup of soup or a glass of water, but it might have been a water drum where someone could change the timbre of a drum by changing the amount of water in it. And so the last part of this one I like to point out is that the anthropologist who did this, based on all of the styles that he was seeing, he created 3 possible cultural areas of where these people came from. Doesn't it already kind of just match up to what we know about the Haudenosaunee? Even though everyone is a little bit different. And once again, you know, how I don't like maps. So I don't actually have That one right there. This one right here. So these two are rattles. This is considered to be a traditional rattle. It's made out of maple and cow horn and seed. This is played in a longhouse. This has been traditional for the last 230 years. This rattle is made out of a baking soda can from the 1930s. It has seeds in it. This other one was made by the assistant manager of the museum where I work, and he made it for me, and he made it out of antler. And so the bottom, the handle is my braid. The middle is our wampum belt that brought the Tuscarora into the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. And then the top are pots, because I like to talk about pots. I like to talk about gender. And then the last thing is the tree of peace. And inside of that rattle are little bone balls that he turned into rattles. And so it has a very different sound. So this has a different sound, and this has a different sound. But in my anthropology courses for 20 years, they would say that this is a traditional rattle. And I questioned that the whole time. Outside of the fact that it was used in a religious space, this was not a traditional rattle in my eyes because it didn't have any of the hallmarks of pre-European contact. It's a cow horn right here, right folks? And so I started to question this, and for a few years I didn't consider this to be traditional. But it started to change my mind when I encountered this one. And so in the 1900s, from about 1900 to about 1932, and there's instances all the way up until the 70s, where the Bureau of Indian Affairs had the right to go on into people's homes and take objects of religious and sacredness. Because the whole idea was to put people on the road to assimilation, to become Americans, to become Canadians. And so they outlawed a lot of our practices. So while people enjoyed the freedom of religion, ours was being taken away. And so back in around the Great Depression, people who held on to ceremonies, they had to find ways of holding on to culture so they wouldn't lose it. And so this can, if I took the pin out and dropped the bottom out, it goes right onto a shelf. And so the BIA agent wouldn't know that they had a rattle in their house. And that changed my mind on what the sacredness of an object is. And it brought this one back closer to me. Because as I'm struggling through these two things, Hayden makes me this thing, and the first day I had it, I was like amazed by the artisticness of it, but I didn't think about everything that Hayden put into it, and it took a couple weeks, really. You know, you look at it every day, you play with it a little bit, and you realize how important this gift is. It's really quite the thing, and it made me realize that all three of these things are traditional. All three of these things are sacred. And not one is less than the other one. Because all of those things that I was learning in school, and you guys learn as well, we don't kind of put them together. We don't understand those gaps in knowledge that we are learning. We don't understand that, you know, something that we take for granted in our education that living people are working through, and they're finding ways to overcome those things. And sometimes these things find their way in a museum. And so if something like this were to fall into your hands and you were to put it somewhere in your museum, you might find yourself not sure what to do. And I'm sure there's been a few people in the past who probably chucked them and didn't think that they were anything meaningful. But for me, that's so important, you know. That held on to culture that I have today through those songs, through the playing. And so for me, you know, when I go into collections, I am seeing worldviews. I am seeing practices. I'm seeing behaviors. and I just don't see objects. And I think that's one of the things that I love about this, because there's still mysteries to me and things that I would like to find out, learn about, because I don't know everything, but I will one day. You were supposed to laugh. No, really, you guys were supposed to laugh at me. But for me, the most meaningful thing that I didn't learn in the field, that, you know, all of these objects are gifts in a relationship. And you're building things and you're maintaining things, and it's really important stuff. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so happy to be able to come in here in person and kind of talk about the stuff that we can do together, or you can graduate and go do on your own, or, you know, there's so much that we can do. Can I share this last picture and I'll stop? So there's a indigenous community in North Carolina called the Catawba. During the 1730s through the 1760s, there was a mass exodus of indigenous peoples out of North Carolina. A lot of them came up to New York and they lived along with the Haudenosaunee. Some moved to Ohio. Every once in a while you'll see a Catawba word in Ohio, and it's for some of these remnant people who moved here. There's not a lot of them in the outside of North Carolina anymore. A few live in Canada and probably none in New York. And these people were federally recognized as Catawba, indigenous peoples with federal rights. And then in the 30s, they lost that status. However, the one thing that they maintained and persisted on from their time of creation was making pots. And so when they got their status back, it's actually the continuation of making that one thing over and over that got their status back, because no one could refute it. On every other ground, the feds were able to refute. You don't have your language, you don't have this customary practice, you lack a history, but they held on to the pottery. And I think that's really amazing. But I will stop there. So, what's that?
I said, don't.
So who's interested in like repatriation? Who's interested in having conversations with museums? Well, Megan Schaefer at Summit, we created a short list one day over the phone. And so if you work with not just indigenous peoples, but if you work with any community in any type of collection, you might want to, think about where people are coming from, right? But I think for people doing this for the first time, don't be worried about making mistakes. We all make mistakes. I make mistakes every day. Be open. If you have never done anything or you don't know what this thing is or this object, ask. It's okay. Don't be afraid. We live in a space sometimes, and I experienced this myself in academia, where after a while, people think you're an expert, and so I became afraid to ask questions for a little bit. Don't be. I ask questions all the time now. Begin small. Don't take on your biggest hurdle and try to run with that. That's where you might trip up a little bit more. Get students in the collection. So a student, if you're interested in this, talk to your local museum and see if you can work behind the scenes a little bit. Don't act like an expert. I do what I love, and I don't act like an expert. You gotta be humble. Because you're going to learn about something that you think you might know very well, and you're going to learn a new angle on it. I promise you. And once you get into that collection and you understand what you have, begin conversations with indigenous peoples, because I, for one, really truly believe that your lives will be enriched by knowing these folks. Knowing that that fortitude of peoples who are able to persevere through a number of things, it can be very rewarding, and my life has been full of rewards. Consultations and relationships aren't the same thing. This happened a lot. So some of my partners sometimes, when I was working for a Native nation, they wouldn't do any work for the entire calendar year, and then the grant is due, or something's due, a report or something, and they're trying to get me to sign off on something that they didn't do, and they're using that relationship. And to me, that wasn't a real relationship. They were using me so they didn't have to look bad or do the work. I don't know. I understand that people are busy. I told you some different elements to history in my talk today. You know, you're not going to find them in books. People always ask me, how do I find this in a book? Oh, I don't know. I don't know how to find it in a book, really. But I do read a lot. But that's where my critiquing comes from. I'm critiquing the stuff that I'm reading because I'm continuing my education. But you have to understand when you talk to your partners, your tribal partners, or anyone who might be different from you, realize that their life journeys might be a little bit different than your own. And then for us, I know this for indigenous peoples, our past isn't in the past. There's a news story that came out today from Saskatchewan where the chief of the Sovereign First Nations Consortium in Saskatchewan asked the Pope to return holy relics back to Canada. And that was today. You know, so this stuff, our past isn't the past. We live with this. And then if you're working and living in Ohio, Ohio is one of those places that we still have to work through a lot of stuff. There was forced removal here, and it didn't usually happen peacefully. Upstairs in the gallery is a traveling exhibit on one of the battles where the Americans, the new Americans, tried to push out the people who were rightfully here. And in one day, 1/3 of the United States Army died on a battlefield here in Ohio. And that could have changed the course of history. And so that exhibit is upstairs.
Right above us.
And then, if you don't know who's in your neighborhood, there are a lot of federal websites. The Department of Interior, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, HUD, how, does anyone know what HUD is? Housing and Urban Development. Sorry. There's a tribal list on that, okay? So there's a lot of ways to find out who to contact if you're interested in doing such things. And then, once again, you know, my name is Dr. Joe. It was a real pleasure to be able to come and talk to everyone here today. And if you have any questions, or you have problems, or you want to work on solutions, or just talk, please reach out. And thank you for having me. You have a question? Your hand was up.
I was just curious about the story of the Pope in Saskatchewan.
I knew you were going to ask that.
Was there a response?
No, not yet. But I thought you would ask.
Does anyone else have any questions? I know there are a lot of people here who probably want to talk to you directly outside of the group. But, any questions?
You used a phrase earlier I didn't really fully understand. It was personal medicine. Could you say more about what that means?
Yeah, you know, baseball players have their little rabbit's foots and things like that. And so for us, so you remember that Gagnon yoke I was saying, where we give reverence to all of the elements? So we believe everything is alive and everything has a personal power. And within this personal power, you can try to utilize some of it to help you with your day-to-day. So if you really like the industrialness of a beaver and the familyness of a beaver, you might try to embody the beaver in some way. And you might start carving things out of wood and stone, or making stone tools that look like a beaver. Or if you ever come across a beaver in some way, you might utilize, you know, parts of the beaver, or just pay homage. And so that becomes part of your, I don't like using these terms, but what you would understand would be like a totem or a fetish. And so that's what that personal medicine is. And so it's not like voodoo or anything, it's just you see the usefulness of this one living thing and you just want some of it to help you with your own endeavors.
In your slide that was up before your presentation, you had the names of translations of native groups apparently. And one was something like people from the South. And that puzzled me because they probably didn't see themselves as from the south, so they're being called from the south. So how did that work?
Oh, so the Cummings Center here has a land acknowledgement. And within that land acknowledgement, they highlight how many nations?
We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Oh, it's like a treaty then or something. This was a.
No, it's a land acknowledgement. I think the center and
Just
the
how they call
university,
themselves.
and I
How they
I
call
hope
themselves,
someone
yeah.
over talks me right now and
People
tells
of
me
the south.
what the university is doing with the land
Why would they do
acknowledgement.
that?
Is it just a reference to the former?
This is where I am. This is where the center is, right? Not from the south, right? That's all.
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know how to answer
So,
that.
do you understand what a land acknowledgement is? It's just reminding living day Americans that there were other people before them here.
Yeah, I just was curious how they were self-describing themselves, you know, and. it
What was
seems
her
like
answer?
That was for the Shawnee. They,
So Shawnee, people of the South.
Yeah.
that is
People
a,
of the south. It seems like you always, cultures tend to self-center, saying, you know, this is the center of the world, and you're from the north, and I'm from here. And rather than describing myself as from a different place, that's the puzzle.
I understand, sir. I don't want to nerd out,
No.
but Shawnee, an earlier iteration is like Savannah or Sewanee, and it means peoples of the South.
Okay, thank you.
And so they just kept on with that, even though the word itself, Shawnee, has changed a little bit. But they were found living in Georgia when the Spanish landed along the Atlantic coast. And so they've been moving all for like hundreds of years. By 1700, they were found in New York and Pennsylvania.
How much of that was voluntary?
I know, that's a good question.
Okay.
would it be fair to say that the term the South is something that in translation was given to them, but
Yes.
not necessarily the concept that we apply to South? Does that make sense?
Okay.
Because this is how their name, how we speak it, is our English version.
Okay.
But in the meaning of their actual language.
They had different perception of what
Right,
we're
so
saying.
South
Okay,
may be
that's
in
fair.
in a version that we as English speakers. would
Yeah, we always impose our
Yeah.
view on the whole thing, right? Okay, got it.
Yes.
The wampum belt. I mean, maybe I know partially the answer to this question, but I would just kind of like to hear your description of it. How does something like that is sacred, that is a living document, that represents this really important moment in history for people, how does that end up here? Like, I know there's probably many paths, but
Yeah, so, you know, people sell things in the past, and people still sell things. But there's moments where there's been conversations in the past where an anthropologist or some type of researcher are traveling through recently settled territories or reservations. And so the original one of this, that image that I was showing, the original was in the New York State Museum for over 100 years. And it's actually, the New York State Museum returned all of the wampum bells to the Haudenosaunee 1 year before NAGPRA was implemented in 1989. So NAGPRA was enacted in 90, New York State did it in 1989. And so, but it took the nations over 100 years to get them back. And that's because New York State, every time that the chiefs came or the clan mothers came, they produced a piece of paper and said this chief sold them to this guy and that guy sold them to us. And so they used New York State law to hold on to these sacred documents for over 100 years. And it actually just took an open-minded museum director, Marty Sullivan, to say, you know what, these aren't ours. This is a living community, they still use them, and here they are. And he gave them back. But, you know, people fall on hard times. And so when you're hungry and you have people crying in your home or someone's out of a job, you know, nothing is that valuable, right? And so I think a lot of times, Kathy, people sold these things because they kind of had no other choice, and sometimes they just disappear.
Earlier when you were talking about pottery, you mentioned that a person who we'll say assigned male at birth, but is producing pottery, right? Like that's sort of outside of the expected gender role, and their gender might be presented in a different, or considered in a different way because of that action. Could you talk a little bit more about kind of how gender was constructed around these activities? As someone who's queer myself, I think a lot about the ways in which gender and behavior kind of align in different cultures. I'm not sure if that's a clear question or not.
You know, Tony, that's actually a very long topic. It's like big and it explodes very quickly. But I want to reassure you that the ways that you think about gender today is not much different from peoples of the past. You know, we're born with spirits, and so we're all born with life energies, and we have a certain length of time that we're here and we're supposed to do certain things. However, in none of that do we say that you got a boy spirit. It's just your spirit. And so whatever manifests throughout your life, throughout your own interest and life experiences will determine that. But it doesn't mean that people, this was a type of world where it happened a lot. But there are many instances where it has happened. For me, I started to see it in the Jesuit relations. Those are documents that were written by French Jesuit priests in Canada. And they talk about a lot of Wyandot and Huron couples, same-sex couples, and men staying home wearing the dress, so to speak. But it wasn't an insult because women are held in high regard, so when you're given a skirt, it's usually an honorary one. All right? And so there's a lot to this, but I have to tell you, it's changing. Like those ideas, we're falling into the same dualities as the rest of the world. And so, you know, we have to face bigotry and closed-mindedness and all of those things ourselves. And it's really unfortunate, but, you know, this is why I keep talking the stuff that I can talk about, because I don't want it to die. And there's a use for it because I believe we all have a purpose. We all have a use. And so we don't denigrate anyone because their use doesn't seem to fit into our use or whatever. But there's starting to be a lot of information, and you got me talking. And I'm sorry.
No, thank you.
Can we do just one more question and then
Yeah.
we'll close?
Hi, thank you so much for your talk. My name is Mary. I'm a developmental psychologist, so a little more on the social science side. And I was just really interested in this. I'm always very interested in the connection between development and context. And so I was wondering, like, how do you make sense when you're looking at these objects of like the specific nuances of the context in which they originated versus like how you're maybe encountering them like as it's passed through maybe the hands of people who are not from that culture before it shows up in a museum or it shows up in something that you're navigating?
Everything has clues.
Okay.
And then, so, you know, when we talk about the loss of culture or forced removal, so some of the communities that used to be in Ohio are now in Oklahoma, and they went on a long journey. And it took them like decades to get to Oklahoma from here. And so along the way, as they were hungry and needing to survive day to day, some of their practices fell out of play. And so sometimes we have difficulty seeing the clues. However, there's a lot of communities in the eastern United States who haven't been completely severed by removal. So my community, the Tuscarora, were located in North Carolina at the time of the Spanish coming to the Atlantic shore. By 1700, we're living in Pennsylvania and New York. And so we were very fortunate in that regard because we were able to live under the umbrella of the Haudenosaunee and we retained most of our cultural practices. However, over time, education and religious institutions have made inroads in our communities, and so we are seeing a change. However, we still have institutions that continue on, and we're able to hold on to those ancient ways. However, we don't tend to think about it like that because, one, they're very contemporary, and two, you know, when you look at me, I have, you know, the clothes that you're wearing, so it might seem like I'm a little bit assimilated, when in fact, you know, it's that internal structure that I'm trying to identify through those clues on material objects. Because there's always clues to have. And there's always continuations. And so I like to use the analogy that if we were to look at the archaeological record and we looked at TVs from 1950 and we were to go dig in the dump and we looked at the newer TVs at the top of the dump and the old ones at the bottom, an archaeologist would say that those were two different cultures probably. But for me, no, I'm looking at the clues to understand how it's been a TV that whole time.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Joe, so much. Before, we're clap.
Thanks for taking this up.